Hey there, my name is AJ Pickett and I make videos about role-playing games, and lots of them. I upload twice a week with a live stream every weekend. You can also find me on Subscribestar, Patreon and Discord, Facebook and Twitter. Also, there's an option to join the channel as a member, and I welcome any questions you have in the comment section down below as always. If you like this video or this channel, hit the like button if you would be so kind, and subscribe. Dragonlance has been talked about a lot lately among the communities of the Dungeons & Dragons hobby, so it's time to cover one of the most iconic races for the Dragonlance setting, the Draconians. Special thanks to Michael G for the help on this lore. It's pretty fresh territory for me. I had to do a complete rewrite of the script because I was using some older source material, specifically the Monstrous Compendium for 2nd edition Dragonlance, which is fine, but it's not the updated 3.5 edition material published by Margaret Weiss herself and a team of writers and guest contributors, which very firmly stamp these third-party published books as 100% official source books, as canon as they can be without being printed in-house by Wizards of the Coast. The Dragons of Krynn, published in 2007, along with Races of Ancelon, published the same year, are excellent source books. I'd say these are must-haves if you really want to go deep into the world of Krynn and its people. They're also well put together and a good read. A good account of the Draconians from the personal perspective of Caramon Majer is found in the original bestiary for the 5th Age of Krynn, which I reference a lot because it's a delightful read. And then the Wizards of the Coast came along, and we have the revised Dragonlance bestiary, the Bestiary of Krynn, published in 2006, again by Margaret Weiss's Production Limited. There is additional info on websites and wiki pages, but I refer back to these published sources whenever I am quoting something in this video. I am quoting a lot because I'm learning this at the same time I am making the video. On a personal note, I have the same feeling I had when I first started delving seriously into Forgotten Realms lore. As I talk about the Draconians, it's very much like I'm diving into the lore at the random point somewhere in the middle. There's so much before and after what I'm talking about. Any thread that you pull will pop up more and more information about Krynn. It's a very rich and complex world setting. I can certainly see why everyone who knows it are very passionate about it. So, to dive into the middle of the story, we have the first of the Draconians and how they were made. And for this, we need to talk about the Trag and the Sesk Draconians. And if you're familiar with one bit of lore or the other and occasionally exclaim, "Wait a fucking minute, where did he pull that info from? That's got to be garbage from a source I don't think is worthy for inclusion." Well, I am here to bring the lore from all the sources and blend it together so it makes a lick of sense, which it does. Just bear with me and never forget, there is fact, there is fiction, and there is mythology in fantasy worlds, which often contains a lot of both. It's not always up to me to point out which is which. I will say that when I talk about the Abishai devils and the dragon goddess Tiamat and her being part of the goddess Takesis, I am taking this directly from the Monstrous Compendium for Dragonlance. I suppose that is a good place to start, so grab yourself a tasty beverage. Get comfortable, this is a long one. We're about to get deeply nerdy as I relate to you what they don't tell you about Draconians, mainly because I know damn well a lot of you Dragonlance fans had nothing at all to do with 4th edition D&D, so you might have no idea what Ferak, Kobaz and Adamaz Draconians are. Well, you made me check all the sources, so be it on your head. And I quote, "Draconians, also known as dragon men, are vile monstrosities resembling a cross between a humanoid and a dragon. These creatures were created by the corrupting eggs of good dragons." And yes, I'll get to the noble Draconians later, the ones created out of evil chromatic dragon eggs and how that backfired spectacularly later in the video. Originally serving as special troops of the Dragon High Lords during the War of the Lance, the surviving Draconians are among the most dangerous and repugnant inhabitants of Krynn. And yes, I will talk about the populations of them originating in the Terra region, who are capable of breeding with each other and have become proper, self-sustaining race. I'll also talk about the wretched dragon spawn at the end of the video as well. So, some background. In the year 2645 in the Age of Light on Krynn, anti-dragon sentiment ran high, thanks in large part to acts of terrorism by evil dragons. A great Solamnic knight named Huma successfully drove the evil dragons to a negative plane, where they were ordered to sleep for the rest of eternity. To preserve the balance between good and evil, the good dragons agreed to depart as well. Takesis, the Queen of Darkness, managed to secure an oath from the good dragons that they would remain in hibernation on the Isle of Dragons, far from the mainland of Ancelon. To ensure their oath, Takesis held the eggs of the good dragons hostage in dark tunnels beneath the city of Sanction. I should interrupt here to point out that Krynn has a high god, A bit like Toril has an overgod, kinda. There is this divine power which forces balance between the forces of good and evil, and neutrality. On the World of Krynn, that is really powerful and has wide-ranging effects that even the gods can't do much about. This is pretty much why there is an even split between the good dragons, the gold, the silver, the bronze, the brass, and the copper, who followed the good god Paladine, who seems very much like the inspiration behind Bahamut, and the evil dragons, blue, green, red, black, and white, who all followed the evil goddess Takesis, and she is essentially Tiamat. The parallels between the mythology of Krynn and that of many aspects of Toril are quite numerous and very clearly. Toril is a bit like an alternate dimension where, again, conflict between these two gods resulted in the birth of a race of dragon people. Anyway, unknown to the good dragons, these eggs were not sheltered and protected as promised. Instead, Takesis betrayed the oath by corrupting the eggs to create the evil Draconians. Evil dragons betraying their oath? Say it isn't so. The corruption involved foul magic performed by the evil triad of Werelish the cleric, Drakart the mage, and the ancient red dragon named Harkiel the bender. Through arcane spells, they caused the eggs to grow and the occupants to multiply. This much is accurate. Karaman Majir says that the embryo inside the egg mutates, the egg swells and then blackens as though rotting. It melts away to expose a wriggling larvae of some kind, which could be a lemur, or just the sorrow remains of a doomed dragon embryo, that then bursts open as the multiple draconian infants are retrieved. But this next bit about where the souls from these extra creatures come from is pretty controversial, but it's legit lore. Werelish opened a gate to the abyss, and souls of the Dark Queen's minions, the Abishai, rushed forth to inhabit the Draconian spawn. This means, if you want to follow that souls of the Draconians are tied to the abyss, yes, but mostly the Nine Hells, since Abishai are devils who serve Tiamat, and perhaps keep her in check under the thumb of Asmodeus. Does this mean the Draconians are actually draconic tieflings? Well, maybe. There are conflicting accounts from what I've seen. They don't actually die of old age. Some think this is because, like dragons, they have a lifespan of over 1,000 years, but it could be that they are sustained by a fiendish soul and will keep on ticking until something kills them. This, of course, excludes any Draconians born by natural means with Draconian Appearance, and it really throws what happened with the chromatic dragon eggs into question, since Abishai are lawful evil, and yet there we have the good aligned noble Draconians. It's all up in the air, really. I think many DMs will choose to just ignore the origin of the original Draconic souls unless it suits their needs. The Draconians became an important part of the Dark Queen's forces when she attempted to conquer Krynn in the War of the Lance. They were ideal soldiers, more predictable than humans and more apt to follow orders than the ogres and goblins that made up the bulk of their army. Ogres on Krynn are quite different to those of Toril, hopefully more on that later in some additional Dragonlance videos. Ultimately, the Dragon Queen's plans were thwarted when the good dragons learned of her betrayal, and once the good dragon forces joined with the good forces of the good races of the world, the evil armies were defeated and Takesis were driven from Krynn. There's a lot of backstory and several wars before the Draconians even showed up, including a big lull in dragon activities for 1,200 years as they left the rest of the world for the other races to rise up and get all self-important. On Toril, the dragons ran into problems with giants and elven super magic curses. On Krynn, they just up and left, went into hibernation for centuries. I should point out that the elves were super dicks on Krynn as well. More on that in later videos. Without Takesis to guide them, the surviving Draconians fell into disarray. The weaker leaders in the dragon armies found that the Draconians no longer responded to their orders, while many of the more dictatorial leaders found the dragon men rebelling against their control. Draconians without positions of responsibility in the armies lost interest in their posts. Though some Draconians remained loyal to their leaders, most abandoned the armies to fend for themselves. Today, most Draconians exist in small bands of marauders living in desolate wilderness areas where they practice banditry, extortion, and murder. I should point out this is the original Draconians. Draconian bands living near cities or villages often turn on the populace in frenzies of pillage, arson, and slaughter. Though they remain loyal to Takesis, the Draconians show only occasional interest in the schemes of their former Dragon Army masters. While Draconian units are sometimes found in evil human armies, they remain aloof from other races, except for evil dragons that they tend to be drawn towards serving. Draconians, of course, have their own view of history, which goes like this. The first step in what became the corruption ritual of Draconian Birth began with the little-known black-robed wizard named Bren, who captured a silver dragon and her clutch of eggs and performed cruel experiments on them. He was stopped by the legendary Minotaur Kaz, a compatriot of Humor, the Solamnic Knight I mentioned earlier. Later, in the Tower of Zaman, the wizard Fistandantilus and other black robe wizards experimented with the nature of life. Fistandantilus was only interested in magic to prolong life, specifically his own, but the other wizards were aiming to build an army of magically spawned creatures for the fight they predicted would come with the rising power of the King Priest of Istar. This set the stage for the Age of Despair, where the evil dragons and Bakali raided the Dragon Isles and stole the good dragon eggs, taking them back to the Lords of Doom and hiding them in the bowels of the volcanoes of Sanction. A decade later, secluded for the last 1,000 years on the Isle of Dragons, the metallic dragons discovered their nurseries were raided, and the red dragon Harkiel presented them with a message from the goddess Takesis, demanding that, in order to keep their eggs safe, they must not get involved with the coming war Takesis was planning. The metallic dragons swore an oath on it, again falling for the same damn trick. In storage, it was discovered that the plague mold of the Zakar had a destructive effect on some dragon eggs, and it was used to create the first of the brutal base draconians named Trags. However, they proved to be useless as a military battle force. A further experiment with the mold was made with the silver dragon eggs, resulting in the base draconians named the Sesk, also unfit for military service. Both of these groups of proto-draconians were then shipped off and dumped in the distant land of Teledus to fend for themselves. 9 years later, Drakart the Black Robe, Wirlish the Cleric of Takesis, and the Red Dragon Harkiel created the first true draconians from the eggs of the good dragons. First were the Baz and the Capacs, then the Bozaks, the Civacs, and the Orax. Each was assigned to the different wings of the dragon armies of Ariacus. High Lords selected particularly exceptional draconians to act as bodyguards and spies to find the missing Greenstone man, Berum, the key to Katis's victory over Krynn, which is complicated. Famous draconians Maranta the Orax were born, Kang, Slith, and Granak were also born. Over the next 4 years, the dragon armies began ruthlessly training their new draconian troops. Signs of mercy were met with death. The weak were culled from the strong. Leaders began to emerge from among the draconians, and the elder draconians were revered as survivors and exceptional among their kind. During these training and culling years, Kang the Bozak demonstrated exceptional skill as an engineer and teamed up with a group of draconian miscreants led by Slith the Civic. They soon became comrades, popular among the soldiers for providing strong dwarven spirits to the troops. Drakart of the Black Robes was unnerved by the intelligence and spirit demonstrated by the draconians, and as precaution, he slaughtered all female draconians and sent unhatched females to be exterminated. However, the female eggs were captured by the dwarves and taken into the bowels of Thorbarden. It was assumed by the dragon armies that the eggs were then destroyed. A few years later, the dragon eggs and the true nature of the draconians was discovered by the metallic dragons and elves, and a battle erupted over Sanction, which resulted in the remaining eggs being rescued. A terrible strategic loss for the dragon armies, and Drakart of the Black Robes was commanded to try using evil dragon eggs to create more draconians. Instead, this failed and resulted in the good aligned noble draconians. Many of those were slaughtered, some escaped. Drakart's last experiment was the creation of an artifact called the Heart of Drakart, which I hope to talk about in a later video. The death of Ariacus, leader of the dragon armies, was the final doom of the dragon armies, which basically scattered them, and the Heart of Drakart was stolen along with several draconian infantry units. Kang's regiment of draconian engineers settled near the dwarven community of Celebundun and the valley between Mount Celebund and the Mount Deshanak near Thorbarden, where they survived through non-lethal raids on the dwarves for the next 30 years. Then Kang and the 1st Engineering Regiment rediscovered the lost female dragon eggs, and 20 female draconians were hatched. At long last, the draconians were no longer a race doomed for extinction. Kang and his men began the long journey to the abandoned city called Ter. This brings us to the Age of Mortals. Around this time, the first dragon spawn were created by a blue dragon named Sky. We'll get to more on that later. Meanwhile, chased by the Dark Knight-trained goblin army, Kang and his group of male and female draconians reached the relative safety of Maranta's fort, where the goblin army was routed. General Maranta revealed his experimentation with using Drakart's heart to create draconian clones. These mindless creatures were cloned from single draconians in their thousands. Often called dunderheads by other draconians, they had none of the magic inherent to their draconian progenitors. Marantha was killed in the battle, and his followers then joined Kang's unit, with some dissension. Then Kang reached Terra and became the Lord Governor. Through the following decades, Terra survived as Draconian territory, and most surviving Draconians have recognized it as the seat of their new culture. Elsewhere, the Blue Dragon Sky perfected his method of making blue dragon spawn, which was then copied by the Red Dragon Overlord Malistrix, and pretty soon the other overlords were all learning their own methods of creating their own dragon spawn armies, but this came to a crushing end with a war with the one god who wiped out all lords. Basically lots of overlords. The nation of Terra, however, survives, fraught with typical politics and threats of civil wars of a young nation. It seems like the Draconian race is destined to survive and thrive on the world of Krynn in the centuries and eons to come. Despite its draconic heritage, the Draconian's body is more humanoid than draconic. The basic Draconian form is that of a biped creature superficially resembling a lizard man. The Draconians are usually man-sized, or larger, with long legs and arms ending with razor-sharp claws. Fine scales cover the Draconian from tail to tip. The nose is distinctly shorter than that of a dragon. The true dragons often see this as repugnantly short and human-shaped. The Draconian skin resembles thick, tough, leathery crocodile hide covered with small scales, not unlike fish scales, that are attached to the skin. These scales are keratinous, like human fingernails, but cover the entire body. Scale colour is dependent on the subrace of the Draconian, but all the scales lose their bright metallic sheen by adulthood. The scales sort of rust along the edges over time, and the corrosion crawls up the scale. From a distance, venerable Draconians look quite dull in colour. There are several different gender differences among metallic Draconians. Males tend to be bigger and stronger with slightly deeper voices. The scales are often larger as well. Females are usually smaller and quicker. Their muscles are geared towards speed and flexibility rather than brute strength. And I must say, quite a few of them demonstrate quite a lot more intelligence. Their eyes tend to have a lighter colour. The Draconian tail varies depending on the sex of the Draconian in question as well. Male Draconians have large muscular tails, while females have more serpentine and flexible tails. Civics have tails large enough to strike or trip opponents, but generally Draconian tails are not prehensile. But with intense practice and training, the tail can wrap consciously around objects, just not manipulate them. Most Draconians simply use their tails for balance. It is interesting to note that many elder Draconians don't have tails. It says a lot about the brutal training the humans used with them when they taught them human combat styles. The tail's weight, affecting their fighting stance, was considered to be throwing off their attacks and dodges, and it was considered worthless. So a lot of Draconians had their tails removed. As more Draconians were being produced in the War of the Lance, training became minimal and docking the tails was less of a priority. But really it was an act of cruelty. The most obvious Draconian feature is their leathery wings. All Draconians but the Orax have wings similar to the Draconian Appearance. Those two arm-like limbs have phalanges resembling extended fingers. Each finger is webbed with a thin membrane of skin. Dragon wings. Among the Baz, Bozacs and Capacs, these wings are only used for gliding, as the base of the wing is attached simply to the back. Civic Draconians, on the other hand, are the only Draconians who can fly, have large spanned wings attached to superior muscle systems and oversized sternum, allowing them the fine manipulation of their wings for flight. The relationship between male and female Draconians is awkward. The existence of females was revealed only in the past few decades, so most male Draconians did not grow up with feminine influence. Typically, it is the female who chooses the mate, which usually involves quite a bit of clubbing and hitting, that's not clubbing as in going out to clubs, that's actual, physically clubbing them, along with no small amount of discussion among the females about the male's qualities and potential. There are no formal ceremonies beyond a physical contest of some kind which is witnessed. On a social and practical level, the contest determines the roles in the raising of the hatchlings. The winner usually takes the challenge of finding food and resources, while the other partner prepares the nest and tends to the eggs themselves. While Draconians do not necessarily mate for life, females usually continue to choose the same mate over and over again. After a gestation period of 6 months, a female lays a clutch of 2 to 8 eggs, which usually hatch within 3 to 6 months. The eggs must be kept in a moist environment at a temperature roughly equal to the mother's body heat. Draconians have a very short childhood, which is typical of most draconic races. The hatchlings can immediately start eating solid foods and liquids, usually preferring meat and blood to vegetables and breads. Hatchlings are very curious and get into all sorts of trouble unless carefully watched. During adolescence, Orax and Bozaks develop their spellcasting abilities and need to be trained to use the power responsibly. Capac, saliva, becomes potent, while Civics begin using their shapeshifting and blending skills pretty much straight away. Young Draconians usually reach adult stature in only 15 years. The exception is the Civic Draconians, who continue to grow, eventually reaching their large size at adulthood. No Draconian has yet died of old age. There are rumours that a Draconian can live for 1,000 years, but this is yet to be proven by anyone, and death usually comes from combat. Given the conditions of battle, as well as Draconians' violent death throes, Draconian bodies are typically not recoverable. The soot from the Civic, the burned remains from the acidic pool of a Capac, or the dust of a Baz statue are sometimes collected and placed in a small clay jar, but if no remains are recovered, one of the Draconians' most valued possessions is sometimes buried under a tombstone with the Draconian's name, regiment, and list of battles. For large engagements with many deaths, jars and possessions are placed in a mass grave and marked with a large marble block where the names are carved together. In Teir, many Draconians now speak a dialect of Nerikese, heavily influenced by ogre and goblin languages or dialects, often slurred by the elongated snout and tongue of the Draconian head. The language often becomes out with a subtle amount of hissing and clicking. Unless the listener is fluent in Nerikese, it's easily to mistake this hissing as a mixture of languages as a nonsensical or possibly their own unique language, which it's fast becoming, really. Draconian spies and traders, especially the Capacs and Civacs, learn many different languages to better disguise themselves during deep recon within enemy territory. Engineers usually understand a good bit of Gnomish vocabulary, including technical terms in the fields of engineering, architecture, and sciences, and of course, Draconic, Elven are arcane languages. Now, to get down to the nitty-gritty, since there are quite a lot of different Draconian races or breeds, I think I will try to stick to the earliest appearing, following by the generations that came after. Each of the Draconians created by the perfected ritual served specific roles within the dragon armies, and I'll mention those as they apply, along with general physical and mental traits, their powers and typical behaviours. Again, there are some Draconians in the list that many players and demons will never have seen before. Bear with me. First up, the Trag Draconians were the first experiments with the corrupting and birthing process, hatched from brass dragon eggs, using a mould and I assume some sort of process. Only a few Trag were born from each egg, and they had very undesirable traits, such as a tendency to fly into berserk rages unpredictably. That made them unsuitable as soldiers in the dragon armies. Also, they were kind of cowardly, so they were sidelined and neglected after they were created, left to fend for themselves. For a time, since they lived and were good fighters when they fought, the lords considered them a success and bred large numbers of them. Over time, however, the Trag began to develop a number of undesirable traits that ultimately made them unsuitable for use in the dragon armies. I suspect that undesirable trait was a large pile of bodies in their wake. They were cowardly, tended to fly into berserk rages, and had the lowest birth rates of all the Draconians from the eggs. The Trag have formed themselves into small tribal bands since they were abandoned. Each tribe is led by a chieftain. These bands of up to 150 Trag live mostly in the deserted villages and cities of ancient Aurum. The more numerous and powerful hobgoblins have made the plains unsafe for their habitation, so the Trag have basically trapped and set up the ruins as protection against their powerful neighbours out on the plains. The old streets are honeycombed with hidden sally ports, rockfalls, dead ends, and concealed ways. The villages are normally organised in a similar manner. At the centre of the ruins is the tribal headquarters. There is always at least two paths to this, and sometimes more. Fanning out from the centre are different encampments, or divisions as the Trag call them. Remember, these were creatures that were raised in a military environment from birth. Each division has about 20 members. These divisions have varying responsibilities, usually assigned to the duty of guarding a specific post or hunting in a given territory. Although carnivorous, the Trag are often reduced to scavenging. Unwilling to hunt for great lengths of time on the plains, they're almost universally undernourished. It's not surprising that they will eat virtually anything, even hobgoblin flesh, that is put in front of them. They tend to only want to fight when the odds are certainly in their favour once battle is joined. However, the Trag become maniacally fearless when they're in battle. They don't tend to use missile weapons, and when they die, they rot away rapidly into pools of slime. Sesk Draconians were the second generation of experiments, as they refined and perfected the corrupting and birthing ritual using the plague mould. Created from the eggs of silver dragons, their masters found the Sesk were smarter than the average Trag Draconian, with a cleverness and cunning far beyond that of their peers, yet their bodies were oddly twisted, as if the silver dragon blood rebelled at this unwanted usage. The Sesk were incapable of fighting as well as the evil lords had hoped, and proved far too creative and questioning of authority to simply blindly follow orders. Since these twisted vessels were patently unsuitable for the ends, the evil lords abandoned their experiment and banished the Sesk to the wilderness of the conquered lands. The Sesk migrated eastward until the peoples of the Steamwall region prevented their further advance. There the Sesk have curried favour with the Herdu, living in ruins shunned by those lizard men, and aiding them in their battles with the hobgoblins who vie with the Herdu for dominance in the foothills. Sesk live in villages organised loosely along tribal lines near and sometimes among the Herdu clans with whom they closely associate. Each tribe numbers between 20 and 80 Sesk with one chieftain. They are fully carnivorous and live by trapping game. They don't care what sort of meat it is as long as it's fresh. The Sesk preference for trapping and catching their food compels them to set up snares and wait at least a day for their captured food. For this reason, Sesk move into an area, stay for one or more days collecting food, then travel without stopping while fueling their body's reserves. Now we get to the next generation. The Baz Draconians were the most common foot soldiers of the dragon armies, comprising the bulk of the troops. The attrition rate has been very high, and while once the most common by far, they may now be reduced to the same numbers as the other draconian breeds. Born from the eggs of brass dragons, as many as 20 could be spawned from a single egg, which explains why they were so numerous. Male bears stand between 5 and 6 feet tall, with the majority of them being on the short side, but stocky. Female bears tend to be lighter in build than males. Bears eat virtually anything, including carrion and human flesh. Baz Draconians have mottled scales in various shades of brass and dark green, kind of verdigreed. Their eyes are blood red and they have slightly stooped shoulders. Their fangs are somewhat shorter than those of other draconian races. Baz favour the uniforms of the dragon armies, and many continue to wear them today. Leather collars and breastplates studded with iron are common, as are layered metal leggings. Since their apparel has been poorly maintained, it is primarily for decoration, offering little in the way of protection. Their size and build are such that they can pass themselves off as a human by wearing large hoods and masks and concealing their wings under their robes. Such outfits enable them to use their typical tactics, which is to pass through civilized lands relatively unnoticed. And while Baz Draconians have wings, they can't truly fly. They either move by walking upright, gliding down from heights, or running on all fours while flapping their wings, which is actually a pretty fast form of locomotion, kicks up a bit of dust. When they jump from a large height, it's usually if they're like 100 feet tall and they jump off a building, they'll glide for like 400 feet, 300, 400 feet. They move either, the latter form of movement is their fastest when they're running along and using their wings as well, and it's kind of intimidating on the battlefield when a lot of them are doing that. Bears live typically lawless, disorderly lives, utterly lacking in self-discipline. They regularly engage in drunken raids and random acts of vandalism. They will most certainly raid breweries and things. They love alcohol, and even the small amounts of it turn them into raging, boastful brutes, and it's rare for them to display any of the inherent good of their brass dragon ancestors, but it's not impossible. Baz Draconians occupy the bottom rung of the ladder of draconian social order. The Baz tend to be self-serving when they think they can get away with it. The female Baz, with their heightened leadership abilities, have helped elevate the Baz somewhat, and the males have typically served as scouts and spies in the armed forces, while female Baz are rapidly becoming highly prized managers and low-ranking military commanders. A Baz's body petrifies to stone the moment it dies. If the creature that struck the death blow used a slashing or piercing weapon, it must make a dexterity save or have its weapon fused inside the Baz's stone body. The Baz statue then crumbles to dust after 1d4 minutes. Items carried by the Baz or any trapped within its stone body are unaffected by the process. The Baz can only be restored to life through the use of resurrection, true resurrection, or a wish spell, and that's typical of all Draconians once they've demolished themselves in death. It is important to point out that Draconians are capable of being good. The original Draconians, who were born of the ritual and were raised by humans to be members of the Dragon Army, were subjected to brutality. A lot of them didn't survive. Those that did are evil because they were made that way. Capac Draconians, wielding poisonous blades and arrows, were born from copper dragon eggs. They were the backbone of the Dragon Army fighting forces, as well as serving as assassins and scouts. Male Capacs stand between 6 and 7 feet tall. Female Capacs are a little shorter, standing between 5.5 feet in height. Both are powerfully muscled, with sleek torsos and long limbs. Capacs avoid any style of clothing that might draw attention to themselves. They're stealth specialists. Their scales are dull copper tinged with green. Their eyes are orange or dark brown. They have short manes of dark brown or blonde hair hanging from either side of their mouths, which is very distinctive. Soft pads line the bottoms of their feet, enabling them to move silently. They speak in a soft, high-pitched whine. The most unusual physical feature of the Capacs is the poison gland located under the tongue that continuously secretes toxic spittle. The glands are capable of producing a virtually limitless amount of the thick yellowish venom, supernaturally so. In females, they instead produce a restorative mucus. Capacs are strictly carnivorous. They eat fish, wild game, and occasionally defeated opponents. The supernatural saliva of a female Capac cures wounds. If she licks an injured living creature, it acts like a healing potion, basically, but only once every 4 hours per creature. The extraordinary saliva of a male Capac carries a paralyzing poison delivered either by bite or by coating a edged or piercing weapon. This basically seizes up the limbs, the joints of an opponent. They are very good at making sneak attacks, love combat, and are perfect for quiet missions of espionage, assassination, and sabotage. These days there are quite a few neutral Capac mercenaries and members of thieves' guilds. The Capac appreciate their place in their social group and rarely attempt to climb over others in rank. Those with ambition are usually compelled to do so because of weak or inefficient leadership in their eyes. The Capac band has a common treasure cache. Individuals seldom keep more than a few coins for themselves, the rest of it's lumped into the cache, and when a Capac leaves the band, he takes his share of the group's treasure with him, using it to buy his way into a new band. The bands of Capacs don't typically disagree, they'll just sort of leave rather than confront and fight each other. Bozak Draconians are magic-using Draconians derived from the eggs of bronze dragons. Their original purpose was to act as junior officers, unit commanders, and military intelligence. Over time, they also became the custodians of Draconian religious practice. Bozak males or females are just over 6 feet tall and covered with bronze-coloured scales. They have dull yellow eyes and grey teeth. Although Bozaks eschew armour since it limits their manoeuvrability, they often wear helmets and leather arm and leg bands for decoration. Their diet consists mainly of meat, fish, fresh or not, and fibrous vegetables. Bozaks of both sexes are cruel and cunning warriors who only rarely spare the lives of opponents. When possible, they strike from a distance with spells or missile weapons and then charge in for melee attacks once they're pretty sure that they can finish off their opponents. Bozaks conditioned for battle never show mercy once they attack, although they do not destroy an opponent if they believe sparing a life can advance their cause. See, the thing is Bozaks aren't particularly special when you compare them to the other Draconians. So they're always a little bit paranoid, like they've got imposter syndrome, and they're always looking, they're always curious, they're always cautious, which is why they're so tactically brilliant in combat. Bozaks given other more functionary roles are less likely to be as vicious. Bozak Draconians are typically evil and tend to be neutral in respects to law and chaos. In the Age of Mortals, some Bozaks have adopted a more neutral outlook, some even showing a tendency towards goodness. Of all the Draconian races, the Bozaks are the ones who most crave adventuring and going off on their own. Some dislike the structured life of the military and prefer a wandering lifestyle. Some become obsessive about accomplishing a quest, regardless of the time, energy, and resources required. A Bozak that has the spellcasting ability of a 4th level sorcerer, which is pretty good, and they are typically deeply religious. It was ingrained in them forcibly since birth. They are convinced of their superiority. Bozaks feign friendship with other Draconian races if it serves their purposes. The gullible Baz are often exploited by the Bozaks in this way. Bozaks tend toward gregarious and social behaviour when not occupied with war or, of course, drunk. Individual Bozak Draconians often forge strong spiritual bonds with other Draconians, and they are more apt than other Draconians to form relationships outside their race. A good example is Kang, who is known for his friendship with several different humans. When they die, the Bozaks dissolve into a temporary pool of acid about 5 feet wide. Civic Draconians formed the elite forces of the dragon armies and were born of silver dragon eggs. Civics are violent, shape-changing Draconians that are among the most powerful Draconians, second only to the Orax, and serve in the armed forces as commanders, guerrilla fighters, and airborne assault specialists. They're one of the few Draconians who don't tend to fight to the death. Get a few good hits in and they may attempt to fly off and retreat. Civics have gleaming silver scales and black eyes, with males topping 9 feet in height. They are the largest of the Draconian race. Some of them are actually large category. They emit a mild odour that smells like hot metal and smoke. Creatures with keen senses, such as dragons, can smell them from a distance. Civics prefer heavy armour specifically crafted for them and keep it well polished and clean, and it doesn't tend to interrupt their flight very much. Civics can run and glide like most other Draconian races, but they are unique in their ability to fly, quite agile in the air, as manoeuvrable as dragons, nearly as fast. They have a number of astonishing traits. Females can blend into their surroundings like a chameleon. A male Civic can assume the form of a large or smaller creature that it has just killed. This shape-shifting is a standard action that must be performed within one round of killing the victim. The Civic's appearance and voice are an exact match of its victim, and it can maintain that shape as long as it wants. But when they choose to revert to the natural form or kill and assume another shape, they can't return to any previously assumed form of their past victims. When they die, if the killer was a humanoid, the corpse of the Draconian assumes the humanoid's exact appearance for 3 days and then dissolves into black soot, which can be very disconcerting if you see your own face in the creature that you just killed. If the killer is larger than the Draconian or not humanoid, or the Civic is female, the Draconian explodes in a 10-foot ball of flame, which is usually sufficient to take out anybody who can't dive out of the way. Civics excel at assassination and then assuming the identity of other beings. They actually enjoy it. Derived from the eggs of gold dragons, the Orax are the most innately powerful of all the Draconians. They're also the rarest. They wear few clothes aside from the occasional garish belt or cape. Soft-spoken and cold-blooded, no act of violence is too extreme for an Orax. They often work as special agents and enforcers. Orax males are about 7 feet tall, while females are slightly shorter, and they typically weigh about 140 to 190 pounds. They are sinewy with short tails and golden scales. Small spines grow from the backs of their heads. They have long, sharp teeth and bulging eyes that are blood red, green, or black. Their bodies emit a noxious sulphurous odour, detectable from several yards away by creatures with a keen sense of smell. Orax are the only wingless Draconians, but they have many powers, which is why they are more powerful than the Civics. They have a 5-foot cone of noxious gas breath weapon they can unleash. It causes poisoning and blindness in victims. A male Orax can assume any animal form of small or medium size 3 times per day. This ability functions as a polymorph spell. When an Orax dies, it explodes in a blast of magical energy. This was typically, however, the damage depended on how many spell slots it had left. This blast deals typically 3d6 points of damage to all creatures within 5 feet of it, if you just want to round it off. Up to 3 times per day, Orax can perform a short-range teleportation. This ability functions exactly like the Dimension Door spell, except it has a range of 60 feet, and the Orax can only transport itself and items it carries. And up to 3 times per day, the Orax can make itself perfectly resemble an individual humanoid and perfectly imitate its voice. This ability functions exactly like the Disguise Self spell. And an Orax has the spellcasting ability of an 8th level sorcerer. They can turn invisible at will, use suggestion, and cast Dominate Person, which they have mastered. Because of their superior intelligence and exceptional abilities, Orax are easily adaptable to all environments, though they prefer secluded areas. Orax tend to live alone or in pairs. Large groups of Orax are never encountered. They just don't get along. Orax collect treasure as souvenirs of their kills, and most other races have learned to avoid the Orax because they can use suggestion and cast Dominate Person, which they've mastered. 4th edition introduced a few more Draconians. Here's where it gets interesting. Adamaz Draconians are born from the adamantine dragon eggs. Indirect and evasive when in private on the battlefield, they make strong, dutiful, hardy soldiers. Their death throw takes the form of a powerful thunderclap that obliterates their remains in an explosion powerful enough to make other people's heads burst. Ferak Draconians are born from iron dragon eggs. Aggressive, spiteful, and brutal, they are born shock troopers. Their death throws see them explode into choking, blinding clouds of caustic rust. Capac Draconians are born from cobalt dragon eggs. Serious, disciplined, and driven, they are natural warriors. Their death throws see them freeze over, becoming supernaturally cold sculpture of ice, so frigid that just being near them can kill from frostbite. Dragon spawn, well, these things are basically horribly mutated people transformed by draconic magic. The creation of a dragon spawn by an overlord requires a few things. Well, it originally did. These days they just use a scale totem, or scale proxy, or something. The scale totem, the blood of a draconian, the catalyst from the overlord themselves, which varies. Calendris would use one of his tears, Melastrix would use a number of things, a fiery breath, a coal ignited from her breath weapon or her blood. Oni Sablet would use her spittle, Berlin Thranox would use chlorine condensed from her breath weapon, Galadus would use his quicksilver blood, and the spawning was typically done in humans and half-elves. When done with other humanoids, it would result in an abomination spawn. The process took about half an hour, and the victim would have to ingest an amount of draconian blood mixed with some alchemical substances. The draconian is usually brought close to death in this process. The victim's mind and soul is fused with parts of the draconian. The victim then changes physically and loses all memories of their past life, at which point they're basically dead. They are now under the control of the overlord that made them, although a few rare specimens retain their free will. If the process is interrupted before it can be finished, the victim will likely return to normal, but greatly fatigued. Dragonspawn are a lot like draconian versions of the chromatic dragons that created them, which is quite confusing when you consider them side by side with the noble draconians, who look very similar but behave completely differently. Dragonspawn have fangs and claws, some sorcery powers, and elemental breath weapon. They also fly, so they're much like half-dragons. The patron dragon overlord of the Dragonspawn can communicate back and forth with it telepathically and see through their eyes. This link to the overlord is critical, because if the overlord dies, it most likely the Dragonspawn will die as well, or be driven hopelessly insane. Similar to the Draconians, when a Dragonspawn dies, it has a damaging death throw, which will match the breath weapon elemental energy type that it has. There are black, blue, green, red, and white Dragonspawn, as well as even rarer types. The sea Dragonspawn have green and brown scales. Their blood is green instead of the wings they have of other Dragonspawn. The sea Dragonspawn have an armoured shell on the back, similar to that of a tortoise. Bone barbs grow down the spine and jut out from the edges, which can be weaponized, and they have long thin tails that end in orange flukes, and when they die they explode into flames. Abomination spawn are those from non-human races such as elves and ogres that underwent the spawning ritual, but transforms each time into a totally unique creature, so you can have a lot of fun with the creation of these things. The only Dragonlord Overlord who made use of these creatures was Oni Sablet. Sable. She purposely created abominations rather than normal human spawn, and they all exploded into showers of acid when killed. All dragon spawn are immune to sleep and paralysis and the damage from their innate magical energy that they have themselves. Regarding the origin of the noble draconians, this occurred after pretty much all of the metallic dragon eggs were liberated from the evil dragon armies, and the dark spellcasters decided to try using chromatic dragon eggs instead. Lord Orax knew no chromatic dragon would willingly give up her clutch of eggs, so they tricked some, most notably the great blue dragon Capac. The lie he told her to convince her to turn over her eggs is unknown, must have been a doozy. To these eggs he added the clutches of those chromatic dragons who, over the course of the war, had disobeyed orders, retreated from the enemy, or committed other offences against the Dark Queen's will. He offered them their lives in exchange for their eggs, and most chose to live. The first tentative experiments seemed successful. The eggs of Cacophanax produced the first lightning draconians. Strong and noble these draconians, Lord Orax is said to have called them, thus coining the name of the new race. Pleased with the preliminary success, he ordered that the rituals go forward with all speed. They began creating draconians from chromatic eggs as quickly as possible, placing the new hatchlings into holding cells until they could be trained properly as warriors. Many were created, although the exact number is lost to history. Eventually they realised that something was terribly wrong. The souls of Krynnish dragons have less free will than mortals to choose their side in the cosmic struggle of light versus darkness. Most dragons are bound tightly to one side or the other. It's that whole High Lord over God balance thing. The ritual to create draconians from metallic dragon eggs severed this connection from the light and aligned it towards the darkness. Near the end of the war, the priests in black robes creating the draconians from chromatic dragon eggs finally discovered that the ritual was working in reverse, creating draconians that would instinctively fight against the Dark Queen and her armies. Many of these noble Draconians were summarily executed. Executing a Draconian is no easy task, of course. The destruction that results when noble Draconians leave behind their mortal coils took many of their executioners along with them. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, were slaughtered like cattle. The Temple of Draconians was said to ring with the screams of the dying for days. Others, especially the more easily controllable Frost Draconians, were kept as slave labour and sent to mines and death labour camps throughout the Calist Mountains and Naraka. Most of these unfortunate died in transit or at the whips of their taskmasters, but some survived and escaped. Finally, some noble Draconians escaped from the Temple of Draconians, aided by the metallic dragons who raided the city near the end of the war. The post-war years were not kind to noble Draconians. For years following the end of the war, the remaining dragon armies conducted a merciless pogrom to eliminate them. Most went into hiding, living solitary and incognito, trying to stay one step ahead of the darkness that hunted them while opposing it however they could. By the Summer of Chaos, most were dead, and by the time the War of Souls was fought to completion, only a handful of each variety remain alive to this day. They constantly look over their shoulder, rejected by most civilized communities, hated and hunted by even the other Draconians. Most spend their lives in hiding, only occasionally finding those who accept them for what they are. The noble Draconians do not, as a general rule, get along with other Draconian types. Most have a deep hatred of dragon spawn, a feeling that they are abominations of evil. Most try to help others in need and render aid when they can. The types of noble Draconians match the types of chromatic dragons. Typically, it's an interesting existence. For example, the Venom Draconians are ultra loners, and they kind of lead an existence where they, because of their black dragon ancestry, they remember what it is to be a black dragon, and they feel shame because they're a good-hearted creature. So while at the same time they revere black dragons and the potential power they have, they also hate and fear that nature in themselves and feel an overriding sense of guilt their entire lives. Flame Draconians are created from the eggs of red dragons. They utilize a fiery rage in order to defeat the forces of evil. They have a fierce temper and will explode into a fiery rage upon the slightest provocation. While they do fight for good, they have their own conduct and they will not always agree with the laws of the land. They believe that one's weapons and tools are an extension of their self and often use their fiery breath weapon to craft their own armor and weapons. Flame Draconians have a limited ability to cast fireballs at their enemies and explode into a massive ball of flame upon their deaths, as you would expect. Frost Draconians are created from the eggs of white dragons. They have inherited the limited intellect and short temper of the white dragons, yet they invariably fight for good. They are aggressive when angered, rarely using sophisticated fighting techniques or language. When a Frost Draconian dies, it turns into ice and explodes into icy shards. They're immune to cold, of course, but vulnerable to fire. Lightning Draconians are created from the eggs of the blue dragons, specifically the first one. They fight ferociously for the cause of good, having the innate abilities of a paladin. They are highly sociable and seek to find acceptance. They have a great disdain for metallic Draconians. Lightning Draconians also revere the gods of good, especially Kiri Jolith, and beyond their paladin abilities, Lightning Draconians make use of their innate Shocking Grasp ability. When a Lightning Draconian dies, it explodes into a massive charge of electricity, arcing from creature to creature like chain lightning. Vapor Draconians are created from the eggs of green dragons. They make use of impressive combat skills and innate divine power drawn from mysticism. Even prior to the Chaos War, when mysticism was not normally available, they had access to magic. It's one of the great mysteries of Draconians of exactly what the origin of their magic is. Like, does it come from Takesis or not? Vapor Draconians have an innate connection with nature and dislike civilization. Upon being slain, a Vapor Draconian's body transforms into a cloud of acidic vapor. Venom Draconians are created from the eggs of black dragons. Despite being somewhat bitter and reclusive, as I mentioned, they still use their abilities to fight evil. The Venom Draconian has a poisonous bite, hence the name, and dissolves into a pool of acid when slain. Venom Draconians are also proficient in the ways of the rogue, especially with the sneak attack abilities. And that, my friends, draws us to the close of an epic video on Draconians. Please hit the like button if you made it this far. Subscribe if you like what I do. Check out my Subscribestar or Patreon and links for all the full scripts for these videos. Buy some Teespring merchandise. Wear your geek with pride. And as always, thanks for listening, and I'll be back with more for you very soon.